Did you know that worldwide, 842 million people will go hungry today? That's about 1 in every 8 people in the world, or more than 2.5 times the population of the United States. Also, 1 in every 5 people live on less than $1.25 a day in the world. That's less than most people pay for a cup of coffee. Yet these families have to decide how to use that money. Are they going to use that money to feed their family? Because if they do, they're going to have little left over for school, for shelter, for clothes, for health care. But the saddest statistic of all is that 18,000 children will die today because of hunger or hunger-related diseases. 18,000. That's like filling 200 school buses full of children that will die every day. Think about this. Every 10 seconds, a child dies because of hunger. So who cares about the poor? Well, I know God cares about the poor. In Isaiah 41:17, it says this: "When the poor and needy search for water, and there is none, and their tongues are parched for thirst, then I, the Lord, will answer them." This verse first says that God sees the needs of the poor. You see, God sees that 884 million people in the world that don't have access to safe, drinkable water. He sees the 3.5 million people who actually die every year because of drinking polluted water. He sees these young girls in other countries who have to walk 2, 3, 3.5 miles just to collect drinkable water to bring home to their families. When we have a drought in my area, all that means is that we can't water our lawns as often as we like. I think sometimes we get self-focused, where we don't see the needs of others. But you know what? God sees and cares for real thirsty and hungry people. You see, God not only sees the needs of others, but he goes on to meet the needs of the poor. In the book of Psalms, it says this. Psalm 140 verse 12 says, "I know the Lord secures justice for the poor and upholds the cause of the needy." God doesn't do what most of us do when we drive by a homeless person on the street with a sign, or if we're sitting at home or watching those sad commercials about the needy and the poor in other countries. You know what we do? We just kind of think to ourselves, "Oh, those poor people. I hope they get better." And then the rest of the day we don't give it another thought. No, God sees those needs, and he actually goes out and meets those needs. I remember when I was younger, my dad was kind of a handyman. He was always between work and between jobs, and one time it was a long time between jobs, between making any kind of money, and we didn't have a lot. And I remember my parents had to make the choice of feeding us or paying our rent. Well, they chose to pay our rent, and we didn't have much left over for food. And then one day, all of a sudden, I hear this knock on the door. And I'm a little kid. I go over and open the door, and there's just bags and bags full of groceries sitting on our porch. I was young. I didn't know what was going on. And so my parents sat me down and just simply explained to me that God had provided for our needs. Now, I know God had actually used someone to go and buy those groceries and anonymously put them on our doorstep. But in my young mind, that was really one of the first times I remember feeling like God cared about me and provided for my family. You see, God cares so much about the needs of the poor and the needy that he not only sees a need, he not only meets a need, but God himself identifies himself with the poor. In Matthew 25, Jesus is giving stories and parables to his disciples, and he's telling them about the kingdom of heaven. And he goes on to describe in Matthew 25 about what the final judgment day will look like. But at the same time, he goes back and looks at what our lives were like while we were still living before we get to the final judgment seat of heaven. And in Matthew 25, it says this. Verses 35 through 40, God the King says, "For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous ones will reply, "Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing?" When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will say, "I tell you the truth, when you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you were doing it for me." You see, God has such a big heart for the poor that he identifies himself with them in the deepest ways. It says he actually feels their hunger. He feels their thirst. It says that he completely identifies with what they're going through. He knows what it feels like to be sick. He knows what it feels like to not be able to take care of yourself or those around you or your family. It says he even knows what they're going through when they're locked up in prison. But then it goes on to say that when we feed people, when we give them drink, it's like giving God a drink. It's like feeding God himself. This is the deepest way that God can identify himself with the poor. And it says that when we clothe people, when we give people clothes, when we visit people in prison or in the hospital, it's like we're doing that for God himself. You see, God identifies himself in the deepest way with meeting the deepest needs of the sick and the poor and those without clothes and those that are people that can't help themselves. God identifies himself with them in the deepest way. I used to work with an organization in downtown Los Angeles where we would host groups, youth groups that would come in who wanted to work with the homeless in downtown LA, some of the poorest of the poor in America. And I got to live in a Skid Row hotel, and I also got to be every day out with the poor and the homeless out amongst the streets, people that lived on the streets. And one day I was sitting in my room and I actually read these verses in Matthew 25. And after I read it, it inspired me to write this poem that I want to share with you. This is called Jesus is Homeless. As we dream of living on streets of gold, thousands experience the streets of LA every day. I recognized Jesus sleeping in a cardboard box alone. I saw Jesus wearing the only clothes she owned. I noticed Jesus smiling in an innocent Hispanic kid. I hope he doesn't join a gang and die like his brother did. I was offered drugs by Jesus, who said he can get me high. I smelt the breath of Jesus as a wino staggered by. I gave my breakfast to Jesus, who hadn't eaten for days. This city holds opportunities to touch Jesus in many ways. I know Jesus sits in heaven upon his mighty throne, but we can reach out and touch him by helping those who have no home. You see, Jesus so much identifies himself with the poor that when we reach out and touch him, when we reach out and touch them, we're actually touching him as well. See, God not only sees the needs of the poor, he goes out and meets the needs of the poor, and then he identifies himself with the needs and with meeting the needs of the poor. That's the very heart of God. That's the incredible, awesome heart, caring, loving heart of God that he has for people that really sometimes can't help themselves and really need help from us the most. So in our next lesson, we'll talk about just how why we should help the poor as well.